Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. We're going to begin here, as we generally do, with our large damp square-headed brush. I'm beginning by applying a mixture of primary yellow and titanium white to the middle of the canvas. Then I'm going back to my palette, grabbing an orange, which is simply a mixture of primary yellow and primary red. I'm applying this around our initial application, and I'm blending the two together softly. Then I'm getting a bit more of a red mixture and applying that to the corners of our canvas, which is going to darken them and also create a bit of a vignette. We want to work in these vignettes in these 10-minute paintings because it darkens the borders and it ensures that the eye remains in the center of the canvas, as the eye will innately go to the brightest portion of the subject or piece of work. Now here you can see that I'm going back and I'm blending everything fairly softly. I'm able to do this because my paint has a good wet life. It has a good wet life because of the interjection of the water on the brush that we use at the start. We don't want our brush to be necessarily wet, but we do want it to be slightly damp, as that really will aid the process. It will also ensure that we're able to apply the pigment fairly softly and we won't get a bit of a toothy aesthetic in it as well. So now I'm going to switch over to my medium-sized square-headed brush and we're going to work in some darker clouds here. We're just trying to build up the layers and ensure we have depth within them. Now this here is a bit of a purple, however, the mixture isn't really blue heavy, it's very red heavy because we still wanted it to be a warm pigment that blended with the atmosphere of the painting. We need it to be red dominant, and when it blends with our initial applications, we want it to turn into more of an orange than it would a darker blue pigment. Here you can also see that we're using both sides of our brush to render different types of clouds. We want them to be always evolving and changing. We want some that are semi-transparent very far in the background, and we also want some that are very opaque in the foreground. They also can break off into smaller pieces, as you can see there. But really, it's the collection of varying pieces that are really going to add an extra level of realism into your painting. Now, I'm using the same brush here, and I'm beginning to work in the mountains in the background. Generally, in the silhouetted sunset paintings, the background wouldn't really have much color in it, and you actually don't have to incorporate any in yours. However, by doing so, you push it farther back in the painting. If you can save your higher contrast pigments for the foreground, you'll generally create much more of a great depth within it. So here what I'm doing, I'm going back over the mountains and I'm just working in some additional pigment because our initial layer was very transparent. And this is an issue a lot of people initially have when working with acrylic paints because they are innately fairly transparent. And when you work with a lot of water, it also thins them as well. So a couple of layers may be required. Then I'm going to switch over to the larger square-headed brush. I'm going to apply some titanium white to the middle of our water, the area which will be receiving the reflection from the sun. And then I'm going to build out around it, slowly moving into slightly darker colors. So we'll actually go into a yellow beside it, and then we'll work an orange, and then we'll work a red. Just kind of in the same way that we did the sky, we're trying to mirror those same colors. However, we're not doing a perfect reflection here. We're not repainting the sky. Instead, we're doing all of this in a myriad of different horizontal strokes. And we're just trying to ensure that it looks like it's moving, but it's not moving too quickly. We want it to be something that's calming at the end of the day, but not stagnant. Now I'm also working in some of our darker colors over our lighter pigments just to ensure we have a little bit of diversity, and it's really going to make those lighter and darker colors pop when they're right next to each other, creating that type of contrast. Here we're working a good amount of red into the sides. However, because we used a pure primary red, one very much void of a mixture, it's very heavily saturated. And so it needs to be toned down, it needs to be darkened a little bit. Here I'm throwing in a little bit of a reflection of our mountains, which is going to aid that. But I'm doing the mountains again in the same way that I did the reflection of all of the colors in the water. It's not a mirrored image, but rather the implication and the color of it. You want it to be much more impressionistic than realistic. So we're going back and we're doing that coloring a couple of times just until we get it exactly the way we want it, but all of our brush strokes are remaining the same in that horizontal fashion, generally done with the smaller edge of our brush. Then I'm going to switch over to my smaller square-headed brush, and we're going to begin working on the foreground. This area is going to be entirely silhouetted because it is very far away from the sun, and we're going to do so with this Mars Black pigment. Now, I can still see my initial drawing because I did my drawing here with a Sharpie marker, and what's great about those is that they don't bleed into the pigments that we're working on, like a charcoal or a graphite might. When you work with those and then you work with a titanium white or a primary yellow, sometimes they can blend and make each other a little bit dirty, a little bit muddy. However, with these markers, you can still see what you're doing so you don't have to redraw your initial sketch, and it doesn't blend in with the pigments, which is quite nice. However, if you did your initial drawing with a charcoal or something akin to that, don't worry, you can go back to the start of the video and you can redraw that in fairly simply. Now here we're making a lot of very fine, sharp lines, and generally the best way to do that is to use a good amount of water on your brush. It will make the application much more transparent. However, it's worth it because you'll ensure that you get those nice, fine, sharp lines, and you'll be able to drag paint out much farther than you normally would be able to. It's also worth noting that I'm using the smaller square-headed brush here because it can hold a good amount of paint, and in addition, it innately has a very sharp edge, which is fantastic for rendering subjects in the foreground with very sharp edges, similar to that of the grass that we're working on at the moment. Now, a lot of people, generally when they want to work on detail work, they'll move to a smaller round-headed brush or a liner brush, and these are great brushes. However, they do innately have that more feathered, rounded edge, which can be kind of a hindrance to this sort of thing because we do want it to be sharp, we do want it to catch the viewer's eye, and that softening effect isn't going to aid our scenario. I generally implore you to save that type of brush, more so for softer subjects, things like mist or clouds, objects and subjects akin to that. Now I'm also filling in the larger silhouetted areas with our medium-sized square-headed brush, just to save a little bit of time here. You could also use the larger square-headed brush, but because we are working on an area very much void of detail, it all works out fairly well. Now, I would like to note that I am tripping over my words a little bit more than usual. We're recording this fairly late at night because currently going through the process of moving. I'm trying to get a bunch of these lessons out. That way you don't miss anything week by week. But I'm bringing this up right now because I will be a little bit absent and I won't be able to be as attentive in the comments as I generally like to be. So if you're scrolling through the comments, you see someone asking a question and you know the answer to it, please jump in there, help them out, and ensure that everybody is learning and progressing and that this remains a very good community where everyone feels comfortable asking things and feels like they're growing as artists as well. But with all of that being said, getting back to the painting, here you can see that I'm working in some additional highlights into our water, really building up that highlight from the sun there in the distance, and then I'm also working in some clouds. I generally would implore you to begin these paintings and work from the back to the foreground. However, we are going to the background right now. It can be a little bit more difficult because we do have to work around our subjects in the foreground, but in this painting, they really aren't that intrusive, and it's good to know that you can still go back and do that. So don't ever feel discouraged because you feel like your background isn't entirely what you want it to be. You can go back to it. You can remedy it. That's something that's so fantastic about acrylic paints. They dry very quickly and very much without texture. So if you don't like something, you can cover it up and you can retry it, or you can jump right back into it whenever you like. It's a very, very malleable, forgiving medium. Here you can see that we're doing that yet again in the water and just creating a little bit of an additional contrast with our darks and our lights as well. Now, with that said, that is essentially what our 10-minute painting looks like this week. I truly hope you enjoyed. I hope you're having a wonderful summer. If you'd like to see more lessons like this, I do post every Saturday. If you'd like hour-long lessons, those are also up on my Patreon account. There are over 10 of them right now, so go and check those out. And if you'd simply like to learn more about acrylic painting, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. With all of that being said, I'd like to say a big thank you. I hope you have a wonderful week, and above all, as always, stay creative.